Hi guys, my name is Claudia and I'm a dog nutritionist, and today we're going to talk about raw food. So, the first thing that we need to talk about is raw food safe to feed your dog? And the easy question is yes, it is. Raw food is completely safe, especially if you feed the ones that are specific to your dog. If you go to a pet store and you go into the freezer section and you see all the raw food sections, you would see that there's quite a few of them in a lot of the pet stores. And if you go into a supermarket, there's loads of raw food as well, because we humans eat raw food too. But there's two differences between the both of them. If you go the route with just getting the raw food for pets, you would kind of know that it's been tested for any pathogens. So that way, when you're feeding it to your dog, you kind of know that it's very safe. But when it comes down to the human raw food, it's not really tested as much because we humans are supposed to cook it. So there might be slightly more pathogens in the raw food in our supermarkets instead of the ones from pet stores, but it's still safe enough to feed to your pet, especially if you freeze it for a few weeks before feeding it. So when it comes down to salmonella, I think that's the biggest one that people think about when it comes down to raw food. And salmonella actually comes from kibble and from raw food and from cooked food. It really doesn't really matter what way the food is prepared. It only really matters if it's been safely handled. So dogs especially, they have a very special saliva. They have lysozyme in their saliva, which is kind of like an antibacterial, we would call it, in their saliva, that kills any pathogens that enter their body, especially if the dog is healthy. So let's say your dog contracted salmonella. The salmonella would shed in the feces for about 7 days. So then you would have to pick up the dog's poop and clean that area very well, especially if it's in your garden. But it's extremely unlikely. And when you look at some of the cases online, I have a piece of paper right beside me here. Out of 16,000 cases in 2007, there was 3 houses that were infected from raw food, which means that it's 99.6% safe. And when it comes down to the year 2007, there was 132 cases reported of salmonella poisoning. And to be honest with you, only 4 of them were from raw food. So all the other ones were either from unsafe handling of kibble or of home-cooked foods. And that mainly comes down to people leaving down the food bowl all day, not cleaning the food bowl, once a day, at least once a day. And especially if you feed raw food, you have to clean the bowl after each use. That's very important. And the handling of the raw food has to be very careful, especially, using cutting boards that are not wood, because they can seep in all the juices. So you can use glass ones, you can use titanium ones, you can use any other ones. I don't suggest plastic ones, because plastics, obviously we have microplastics and it's pretty bad for our pets to have microplastics in their food. And then you can have containers that are glass ones as well. You can use single-use lunch bags to store the raw food in. And there's many more that you can think of yourself as well, like washing your hands before and after handling, just to make sure that it's safe for you to feed your dog your food. And then when it comes down to dogs eating raw food in general, so dogs are factulate carnivores, which means that they eat food from animals and they eat food from vegetables and fruits and starches, the usual ones. But dogs have a gene called AMY2B gene, and that gene helps the dog digest carbs. And there's many dogs that have only 3 copies of that gene, but some dogs can have up to 32 copies of that gene. So it really depends on the dog breed, especially if they've been very altered over the last few years, like a very properly mixed breed with loads of new breeds that are out there currently. But that gene helps them digest carbs. But that doesn't mean that the body needs the carbs. So when you have a factulate carnivore, especially in the wolves, thousands of years ago, they would eat the animal as a whole, including the fur And if there's any stomach contents from, let's say, a rabbit or a rat, they would have a lot of fruits and vegetables and seeds and nuts inside that stomach content. So that would be digested. When it comes down to bigger animals' stomach contents like beef and lamb, then it wasn't really eaten as much back in the day because obviously the smell from it wasn't really that attractive to them. But nowadays, because of the way it's processed, it's a lot more healthy for dogs. So it's great to include the stomach from, let's say, beef in a dog's diet if you're feeding raw. So let's talk about the differences in the blood tests. You can see right beside me here that there's 3 different blood tests that would be slightly different. You can see that it's very minimal. But if you don't tell your vet that your dog is fed either raw food or fresh cooked food, they might be slightly alarmed when it comes down to those blood tests. So when you go to your vet, obviously when you're doing a blood test, you have to let them know that your dog is not being fed kibble, just so they can take that into consideration. And if your vet is trying to, tell you that fresh food is not great for your dog and you should feed them kibble, and they try to recommend you food, from their clinic, I suggest running away. And I suggest finding a vet that is, not really very biased. Like they really are open to what you're feeding your dog. They're open to how you care about your own dog instead of them caring about it. Because there are some clinics out there that are sponsored by the big brands and they will only give you the kibble from the big brands. And then your dog will get sick even more, and they're getting more money from your dog getting sick, and you're losing your pet early on in life. So what I always suggest, like we just said, find a vet that supports your feeding style with your dog. Next thing we're going to talk about is the different feeding styles for raw. So we have prey model raw, which basically feeds whole prey, such as rabbits, you have rats, and you can also feed parts of the bigger prey nowadays, lamb and beef, chicken as well. You can feed duck, turkey, and etc. But you can see a sample diet here from the prey model raw, which you can kind of see where I'm coming from with the prey, because it's mainly just meat. There's not really that much vegetables in it, and there's fur inside it. Obviously, I suggest some supplementing when it comes down to this feeding style, because it can lack some vitamins, but the supplements are all natural if you were to have a assessment with me. So the next one is DIY raw. So you can see here another style of DIY, and with that one you can kind of do whatever you'd like, but I always recommend we have at least 10 to 12% bone. Then you have your normal muscle content, you have liver, you have another secreting organ, which could be pancreas, which could be any other ones other than the liver, but not heart, because the heart is also a muscle. And then we have the ancestral diet, which you can see beside here. It's very similar to the DIY one, but it's more strict about what it feeds. And then we have the barf one. You can have a look here as well, which is kind of very similar to all the other ones, but it has its own style. So everyone loves feeding its own ones. I personally love feeding the DIY one because you kind of can pick and choose what you want to add into the food every single day. And that way in the DIY ones, you can add muscle meat and bone and fish, and you can do vegetables and fruits, and some days you can do nuts as well. Sometimes you can do fur. So it really depends what suits you on that day. So the last thing that we're going to talk about is the lifespan of dogs being fed a fresh food diet. So when it comes down to dogs nowadays, with all the kibbles that are out there, dogs, they've lived for about 17 to over 20 years ago when it came down to only feeding fresh food. There wasn't really kibble out there, years upon years ago. They were all fed food that basically the humans fed as well, were fed at home. And the dogs lived a very long, happy life. And nowadays, dogs have chemicals pushed onto them, loads of medicine pushed onto them, kibble that is not good quality pushed onto them. And the lifespan have actually went down from 17 to 20 years to about 8 to 10 years. And they're saying that when your dog turns 7 years old, they're already a senior dog, which in reality is not true. When it comes down to dogs being fed fresh food, you can see that a dog that's 7 years old that's being fed fresh food has so much more energy than a dog that's 7 years old being fed only kibble. And, obviously, If your dog is fed kibble only, you can, add toppers onto it. You can reconsider, which kibble brand is the best one to feed your dog. So we can all make adjustments. You don't have to just feed raw, you don't have to just feed home cooked. You just feed your dog what you think is best for your dog. But that's basically it for today's video. I hope you really enjoyed the video, and if you have any more questions, you can leave them in the comments and I'll answer them for you after the video comes out. But thank you so much for watching. Bye.